Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. In today's video we will be working on the Mark II for the Adirondack chair. I had a couple of customers come up and take a look at it, and they enjoyed some different aspects of it, and they had some different little things they wanted changed on it. So I have already made two of these for them, and they really enjoyed them and wanted an additional two. So we are going to be making those two Adirondack chairs today, and I decided to bring you guys along and kind of show you some of the adaptations and changes that I have made to the original Adirondack chair on my channel. And this is, as I said earlier, or a moment ago, Mark II for said chair. And the only things I've done so far is I've processed some pallets, and I have planed the material, as well as I've also sanded the edges smooth just to kind of save time a little bit. Other than that, one of the things that is the main design change is I was originally utilizing this middle piece here to be my back support and what everything would attach to in a flat plane. Now I had originally thought about utilizing a curve, but as you can see, this is not enough material to create a curve. I would need it out a bit further. So one of the things that they had wanted was a curve. I kind of thought on it pretty hard for a little while and came up with an idea to kind of fix that a bit. So what I did is I took the two end pieces of the same just stringer out of a pallet, and I made the cuts and I glued the two together, and that created these. So as you can see, it gives you that extra distance that you just don't get from a normal pallet. It gives you just a little bit longer, and it's still a very strong joint, and I'm able to create a curve. I had one failure. I didn't use enough glue, sadly, but this will give you kind of an idea of what that looks like. So after everything is glued up properly, you get this kind of wishbone look for the curve. Now, of course, not broken. So one of the things in my first preliminary setup was, of course, to use more glue. I was very sparse on how much I used, which for any glue up, if you're in the woodworking industry at all, you know you need to use more glue than you expect you need to. So one of the extra things I did was I also took a little cutoff piece, just thick enough that what I would do is take this piece and screw and glue to adhere kind of an extra backbone on that joint. And that's more or less just for my own mental sake. Otherwise, I have tested this joint just with glue and it is more than strong enough. But because I had one possible failure, and that this is something that is going to be for a client, not for my own use, I felt like throwing just a little extra bit into it. So that is the back brace, and I utilized 3 this time versus in my original Adirondack chair I only used one for your arm support and then one for the very back support. Alright, let's kind of go over what I've done so far. So my foreman had taught me in the past to always keep a template whenever you're doing batch making. So when I knew that my customers wanted 2 of these chairs and they were the first generation for me, and I had a lot of like customization put into it and a lot of thought, I thought I might be coming back to do another set, so I definitely want to make sure I at least keep 1 or 2 templates around. So the first template I made was for the legs. So on here, I created my first miter, which is just kind of a downward angle, about like a 5 degree or so. I'll check real quick. And then I had another one on top. My thought being, as you sit in the chair as an angle, you would have this first set, so you wouldn't have just a sharp 90 in the back of your legs like my first generation was. I had this cut on my first set, but I didn't create this second cut. So I did that one to kind of help with that angle a bit. I didn't want it to be absolutely flat on your leg with level with the ground, so this is just a little bit more of an angle right there. And then I complemented it by doing a back end taper as well. And these are rough cuts, so I tapered in the back more for just the visual sake, and then I made sure to match this angle to the top here. So as this kind of sits flush, this is ever so slightly not exactly matching on the front end to help kind of with the natural curve of behind your kneecap where your leg is going to be resting. So a board's going to go against the face and it's going to go against the top, and then you're going to have an additional 4 boards that go down. The dimension for where your actual back of your chair starts is going to be 16.5 inches from this point right here. So 16.5 inches is where I will be putting the front part of the curve. So as it curves around and it stops, that's where that 16.5 inch mark is going to be. And then back from there is where the actual backrest is going to be. So I'm making 2 chairs, so that means I have 4 legs. As well as I took, as you saw at the very beginning, just one of these and cut it dead center. I did also make a couple cuts on the ends just to take off the blue paint that was on there. And what this ultimately ended up being for me was 20 inches. And then on the last little bit right here, ended up being 5/8 of an inch. So 20 by 5/8 is what each one of these is going to be. And this is what your armrest is going to actually end up being. So you're going to have the bottom of your chair resting like this, and then I think I have it, yes, like this. It's going to line up on that piece on the outside of the chair, and it's going to rest right where that angle is, as you can kind of see there. So the very back or front of this piece, back to me, front of the chair, is going to rest right up against that. And then you can either angle it off this angle to match the front, or what I'm going to end up doing is I'll give a final dimension from the ground to the top here, which if I remember right was just under 14 inches is what my original dimension was, so if that helps. Once the boards are mounted on the top of the 1/2 inch board, just go down, I think I ended up being 1/8 less than a 14 inches from the top of the board to the ground. As for the arms, once I've constructed the back and I have placed it 16.5 inches on either leg and I have my supports going across from that, that is what's going to determine the length of the arms. So for the arms, we're going to want ever so slightly, just like a 1/2 inch past the front board on the bottom rest. So that's where you're going to kind of have your arms rest, is a 1/2 inch past. And those are to be determined for what their actual length is until I get everything assembled for the bottom. As for the widths on the back, I went with 20 inches flat. So from this side to this side is 20 inches. And then to figure out your actual curve that you cut into this, what I ended up choosing to go with was a depth of 2 inches, or 2 1/8 inches deep at its deepest. And then at either end is where I started. So I just started at 0 essentially, and then I dropped it down to 2 1/8 inches, and I just mirrored it on both sides. So that's kind of how I just figured my gentle curve. So you can do like a flat line and then just increase and decrease your dramaticness. I did just a gentle curve, so that way I can use wider boards without having to create smaller boards. If you make it too dramatic of a drop suddenly, you're going to have to create a smaller board to be able to create that kind of bend with it. Otherwise you'll have some odd gaps where the board won't actually meet with this as structuring, and it'll kind of creak and be odd and end up becoming loose very fast. So you want to have this as close knit as you can to that gentle curve. And like like I said in the beginning, I have 3 each of those per chair. So that's just kind of a general cut list. As far as the width of each board, I'll be cutting those next. Those will also be 20 inches to mirror the back pieces. So that way they're all the same dimension going down. So let's get cutting those. Alright, so for the back piece, quick little explanation for you. So I went with a stair-step method. So there's going to be 2 of each one of these. The back main center board is going to be 32 inches. Next one falling down from that one is going to be 29.5 inches. And then the last one is going to just be a flat 27 inches. Reason being for that is it's 5-inch drop from the smallest to the tallest, and then just a split in between. So 2.5-inch drop, 2.5-inch drop. I'll put more visual there for you. So 2.5, 2.5. And that's going to be the basis for the back. You're going to have center, next one over, and the next one over. So that's what the back is going to look like essentially on a flat plane. Only it's going to be a bit more curved. And there's going to be, that is going to be one side, and then the same on the other side. So you're going to have a total of 6 backboards. And then like before, for the actual seat, we're going to go off of 20 inches. And I forgot to give you earlier the total overall length going from this tip right here to the very back. At its longest point, it's going to be 35 3/8, what I have as my template. And I went off of a plane 15 degrees. If you flip it over, it's 15 degrees as well. And then what I went for this part here is once you have your 15 degrees, you just cut off of that one 15 degrees. And that way it just keeps it simple. So you just set your miter up to 15 degrees, cut the back, flip over, cut the front, and then go off of that newly cut 15 degrees and then put another 15 degrees on it. So that way it's pretty simple and straightforward to remember. And I did the same thing for the bottom here. So you have 15 degrees, 15 degrees, 15 degrees, and then off of that 15 degrees, the 15 degrees. Alright, let's take a quick second to talk about sanding and why it's so important. So for this build, you'll end up with these little wishbones here. And there's some different things that I do for technique. I round the edges of the inside, even though I'm going to have boards going like this across it. Reason being that I do that is the more times that you lean back in this chair, rock and bend, that becomes a point where it splits, cracks, happens all the time. Same reason I do it on the ends. Now, 3 of these are going to be identical. The one in the center though is going to be what mounts the end of the armrest on either side. So that is going to have a piece laying against it flat. Now, regardless of it being that piece, top or bottom, I will also round all four sides here, including this little overhang. Same reason. So if these are all straws, essentially with any tree, and you have your top and you have your bottom, it will constantly have a fault line essentially going the length of the material. So if I round over all of the edges, including the back, that gives me a better chance that if this does knock against something, fall over, or it gets transported, it has less of a chance for it to hit one of those kind of Achilles heels and cause a crack or a split. And I do it on the back sides, not only for a feel, but also for the ability that this will last even longer now. So you will have 6 of these pieces. And from those pieces, you'll also get these. You want to hold on to these. They're going to be a little too thick for our purpose though, so you're going to actually have to rip them down to a 1/2 inch is what I ended up planing my material down for. So the reason we're doing that is if this is your back piece and it's going to have the curve of all of your material on it, then when you go to line up one of these boards, you're going to end up with this void. So what you can do is split this down to the same thickness as your boards, whatever that may be, if you're planing it, or if you're just going to kind of lightly sand and go raw from a normal pallet size, or if you purchase material, so on and so forth, you can then rip this material down to the same thickness as your boards. That will give you the ability to have something that fills that void. Now granted, this is going to have the material of these 6 boards lining the whole back of this, so it's going to come out however thick your material is, but this is a good way to not only reuse material, but it'll help give you a flat edge and profile to then have your 6 planks that you'll sit on. So once you're done cutting it out, just remember to keep your cutouts, and then on those 6, that gives you 6 options to choose for 2 seats essentially, or 3 if you're just making 1. But it'll give you 3 options to then split down in half using either a table saw. I use my bandsaw just because it's easier, and since I have a smaller shop, pulling out the table saw isn't bad, but I want to make sure I have enough material and enough work ahead of me to make it kind of worthwhile. Otherwise I'll just rip everything down on the bandsaw, make it easy. So make sure to rip your material down to the same thickness as your bottom board. And we'll continue on. Okay, quick side note. So for the little bridge pieces that also go across these, I just kind of went off of a ballpark estimate based on how much overhang I was kind of wanting. So as for these, they are 9 inches long and 1.5 inches wide. You can go skinnier if you need to, depending on how much material you have left. You can go wider if you end up using a 2x4 or something like that. Replicate the whole process going that way with either purchased material, or if you end up just having a bunch of 2x4s you found, this process is also capable with such material. I have sourced 2 out of 1 for the little back seat part. So those mixed with these, we will get those mounted up next, and then I will also jump over and start on the bottom, which, like I said before, is 16.5 inches from this point back down to here for the back piece. So you can either start with this, or you can mount up and make your backs first and mount those on as well. I actually might opt to do that now that I think about it. Either way, just make sure to maintain 16.5 inches to where that curve starts, as far as the tip of it, not the back of it. And that'll give you where you need to be for the seat rests, and then having 1, 2, and then an additional 4 on top of the planks. And that's just kind of a rough estimate. Depending on some pallets, you might have really wide boards, and you also might have really skinny boards. So you can kind of pick and choose and play around with those as well. So, if you're following along, what I've done so far is mounted on these little pieces here. I ended up having to trim them down a little bit because this is a little thinner than I had originally anticipated, which is fine. So this is actually just an inch. I had to shave off a bit on there, actually a little over an inch. But I countersunk and screwed those in as you saw. I glued it as well, so it's a larger surface area that's actually creating a bond, so that way it acts as a bit more of a backbone. So that way, instead of having one point that may be strong but also could be a little bit weaker, I now increase that for a larger surface area. And it kind of made it just a little bit more heavy duty. I laid out 3 of them. What I'm doing is I'm just utilizing my wall as a flat representation for reference. So as long as this material I trust is flat in and of itself within 20 inches I'm going to be working with, my bottom piece goes against that, and then I'm going to take the boards and I'm actually going to take a little scrap, a remnant cutoff piece. It's the same thickness. I'm going to slide it in. So that way, this just goes against that piece. Reason being is, when we have our 2 runners for our legs, they're going to go on the outsides of this bottom piece. So that middle additional piece that I added on will go below everything and not have any form of reference. But it is also crucial for my design that the boards stay up here and don't interfere with going down this piece, because that we'll utilize it later and I'll show you what I mean. So for right now, with our guide piece in, we'll take the 2 longest boards, make sure all of our references are good, flip, orientate, see which way we like this to look, get it all lined up. And this is for a couple of reasons. I'll actually throw another scrap in here so that way I get the full distance. There we are. So reason being that I'm doing this is that way I can visually see what I'm working with. I can figure out the orientation between the 3. So this middle one is just there to kind of help brace. Right now we're not actually running any of these screws because we'll need to figure out this floating distance for our armrest at the end. So we leave this piece off and just do bottom, and then we want to get this close and do the top. So the customer's preference I actually really enjoy. She said that she wanted it down just a little bit from the top, which makes total sense because it gives you a little bit of flex capability, and bringing those just even a little bit closer will actually increase the strength of the overall unit as well. And when you're handling it and moving it, it does look a little bit better too, just more aesthetically pleasing as well. So, that being said, what I can do for reference is I can get that pretty much right to the edge of my table, that flush with the bottom, and then I can start going through mounting up screws. Now I did in the original setup not have that bottom board on, so I should technically allow that overhang from my original so they match up, because this is actually going to be 2 that are going to be matching the 2 that I made prior. So I'm kind of have to trace my steps here a bit. So we'll get that pretty much right on the edge for me, and like I said, just a couple inches from the top. You can do this is probably about 3 inches from the top, and then get everything lined up. You're gonna have a little bit of a slope, so trying to keep it up is gonna be a little difficult. You can do a couple different methods at this point. You can use a separating little piece of wood that you stick in there to help gap all of these to a particular thickness that you want. That's gonna take a little bit more time. So usually what I do is I just get it to visually looking even apart, and what I'll do sometimes is mount either end, because I know this dimension isn't going to change for the outside ones, and then I can play with the 4 on the inside and kind of figure out my gap and spacing. And then once that's done, all I want to do is run a single screw in the dead center of each one of these. Reason being for only one is that since we're playing with a curve, if I run 2 screws, I have a better chance of kind of putting a little extra force and potentially snapping the board. If I do one in the dead center of it, it gives just a little bit of play. And what I'm also going to do is glue these back supports, or little like ribs, if you will. I'm going to glue every single one of these joints, but I'm not just going to lather the whole thing, because since there's gap, you're going to see the glue. So even if you stain it, a lot of glue will resist stain, so that way you're not going to have this yellow or just kind of off color from the rest of it if you choose to stain or whatever for the future. So I'm only going to glue about that much of the board, leaving a healthy amount from either edge. If there is a little bit of spillover, I can still wipe it, but I'm not having to just absolutely clean gobs of glue off. Alright, so at this point you should have 6 boards mounted in. Just kind of space them about a little bit apart. So I have a mess up on my dimension. I will correct it earlier on. So we are measuring from this point, not this point. So it's a definite difference, but measuring 16.5 inches from here to right when the curved piece starts. So not the back of the curve. We're measuring from this front end. Figured I'd add that, but I'm going through and screwing and gluing each one of these joints. So as you saw in the time lapse, everything is drilled, countersunk, and then I apply glue that just goes out to about here. Like I said earlier, I don't want glue going in between here to where you can see it. Same with the back. This is glued and pin nailed in the back as well. And this chair is to the point where all I have to do is put on the front legs, and then I will dimension out the arms from there. And I have a few different dimensions I went off of. These legs here, I just tried to make sure that they are 14 inches to this point right here from this board. So just under 14 inches actually. So it should be like 13, and I think I went with 7/8. So just 1/8 of an inch under 14 inches is what my dimensioning is. So primarily what you get out of these for length ends up equating to roughly around 20-ish inches, a little bit over usually. So when you drop that down, that kind of evens out most dimensions for these. So if you have 20-ish inches, a little over, closer to 21, then you will have the ability for 14 inches of your dimension to work best for lift. So as this is in the upwards position for the angles, for the 15 degrees, as you saw earlier, that works the best. So I put on the arms, as you saw in the time lapse, by drilling some holes once I got my dimension off of the back, by just lining it up, making my cut. I did a kind of longer cut in here. The reason I did this taper is so that way it would shorten this material while still leaving it bulky enough for the actual arm. And that gave me the ability to utilize my 2.5 inch screws without having to go into like 4+ inch screws to get into the meat and potatoes of this backbone right here. And as you kind of saw in the time lapse, what I did to find this distancing was once this was mounted up with what I wanted for the height overall it was 13 7/8 is what this board right here went up to. And then the additional on top of this for a overall board length of just over 20 inches. And that flat platform is where I lined this up. I drilled 2 holes, or put 2 screws in, and then drilled all my holes while that was holding on the backboard, or backbone. And that gave me the ability to then take that off, throw glue on the back of this, re-zip those back in, make sure everything was good and countersunk. And then this was a bit of a pressure fit. So I made this just ever so slightly too big for this dimension, so that way this would kind of pressure fit it in there until I got it zipped, but then also it was a nice snug fit. And this board, because it's pallet wood, I wanted a flat reference point, so I let it stick out just a little bit so it guaranteed that this would be nice and snug against this and not against this main face board here, and then leave a gap where I actually wanted this to meet up. And I made sure to glue these joints on both sides by just pulling these apart and putting the glue on the inside. And that's it. 3 screws, countersunk, this was all glued, and it turned out fabulous. Real excited about it. That taper worked out good for the 15 degrees by 15 degrees by 15 degrees off of that 15 degrees. And like I said, you're going off of this reference point to the very edge right here is 16.5 inches, which should give you 4 boards before the taper and then the front cap. And I'll do kind of a span over this outside so that way you can kind of see what it looks like all finished and in the real world. Alrighty, so there you have it. Turned out really good. I'm enjoying this new redesign on the Adirondack chair Mark II. The curve in the back and being able to come up with that solution to being able to still utilize pallet wood, which is just something that I feel is 100% my medium. I really enjoy working with it and just all the fun things and challenges it presents in the best of ways. And hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you liked it. If you did, make sure and hit like on that good old video there. It helps out greatly. Subscribe if you haven't already. It definitely helps me out, and it also gives you the ability to reference back to my page. That way you don't forget Double Bits Workshop. And hit the notification bell if you want notifications each time I come out with new content, such as the Adirondack chair Mark II. So thank you all so very much for watching, and have yourself a wonderful evening.